Welcome back, dreamers. Tonight, we're unraveling the threads of a legend you think you know, a tale wrapped in cheer, steeped in tradition, and dressed in red. But what if the story of St. Nicholas didn't begin with joy? What if the man behind the myth wasn't a jolly figure, but something darker? Legends have a way of hiding the truth, burying it under centuries of stories, songs, and smiles. But the truth has a way of clawing its way back, and tonight, we'll dig it up. Tonight, we'll uncover the chilling origins of the man who watches while you sleep, who knows when you've been naughty or nice, and who delivers far more than gifts. Prepare yourselves, dreamers, for the real story of St. Nicholas, a story of judgment, fear, and twisted justice. Keep the lights on, and whatever you do, stay good all year, because Nicholas is watching. This is St. Nick's descent. The snow fell silently over Kaleheim, its weight bending the branches of the great pines that surrounded the village like sentinels. Smoke rose from chimneys, twisting into the night sky where stars gleamed like shards of broken glass. Inside their homes, families huddled close, unaware of the eyes that watched them from the darkness. Nicholas stood at the edge of the forest, his boots buried deep in the snow, his breath curling in white wisps around his bearded face. His coat was threadbare, his gloves worn thin, but he hardly noticed the cold. His focus was entirely on the house before him, a small crooked structure where candlelight flickered weakly behind frost-coated windows. The tailor lived there, a wiry man with thin lips that never seemed to smile. Nicholas had watched him for weeks, seen the way his wife flinched when he raised his voice, the way his eyes narrowed in disdain when poor villagers came begging for warmth. Just yesterday, he had thrown a boy out into the snow, his torn coat clutched desperately around him. Nicholas's jaw tightened as he remembered the boy's trembling hands, the way his breath hitched when he tried not to cry. The boy had looked up at the tailor with hope crushed in an instant by the man's harsh words. He adjusted his scarf and crept closer, his movements muffled by the thick snow. Peering through a gap in the curtains, he saw the tailor seated by the fire, a half-empty glass of brandy in his hand. His wife was across the room, silently mending a garment by the dim light of an oil lamp. She looked tired, defeated. Nicholas watched her hands, pale and trembling as they worked the needle through fabric. He had seen her earlier that week at the market, clutching a handful of coins and bartering for bread. The butcher had mocked her, loud enough for the other villagers to hear, but she had said nothing. She deserves better, his breath fogging the glass. The hours slipped by, and Nicholas did not move. He stood as still as the trees, his eyes fixed on the lives unfolding before him. The tailor argued with his wife, his voice sharp enough to cut through the crackling fire. He slammed his glass down on the table, and she flinched, retreating into the shadows of the room. It always ended the same. The tailor would eventually pass out in his chair, and she would sit in silence, staring at the fire until it burned low. Nicholas waited until the house grew dark, the light extinguished and the sound of snoring filling the air. Only then did he step away, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had seen. He moved to the next house, a larger one where the baker lived with his family. The baker had a reputation for his generosity, but Nicholas had seen what happened when no one was watching. He had seen the baker take extra coins from the children who couldn't count, seen him curse under his breath when an elderly woman needed help carrying her goods. The man's windows were frosted over, but Nicholas found a clear spot at the corner of the pane. Inside, the baker was laughing with his wife, his ruddy face flushed from too much wine. Their children played at his feet, their giggles muffled by the glass. The scene should have warmed Nicholas's heart, but it didn't. He had seen the baker's cruelty when no one else was around, seen the way his smiles vanished the moment it no longer served him. Kindness shouldn't come with conditions, Nicholas muttered. As the night stretched on, he moved from house to house, his boots leaving a trail of deep imprints in the snow. He saw the cobbler, who lied about the quality of his work to cheat his customers. He saw the farmer who kept his grain stores full while others went hungry. He saw the drunkard who shouted at his children until their laughter turned to tears. The village was small, but its sins were many, and Nicholas saw them all. He returned to his cabin just before dawn, his beard dusted with snow, and his hands numb from the cold. The fire had long since gone out, leaving the room icy and dark, but he didn't bother to rekindle it. Instead, he sat at his workbench, his gaze fixed on the unfinished toy before him, a small wooden angel with delicate wings. His hands trembled as he reached for his carving knife. The blade caught the faint light of dawn as he pressed it to the wood, shaping it with slow, deliberate strokes. "They don't deserve these gifts," he murmured. "Not yet." Nicholas's gaze drifted to the row of finished toys lined neatly on the shelf. Wooden animals, dolls, and soldiers, each crafted with care. They had been made for the village children, but now they seemed meaningless. He thought of the boy outside the butcher's shop, the woman at the tailor's table, the children who cried in the shadows. They deserved something more than toys. They deserved justice, and Nicholas would deliver it. The village of Kallheim woke to another bitter morning, unaware that the toymaker had begun crafting more than just playthings. Nicholas sat at his workbench, the soft light of dawn casting long shadows across the room. Before him lay a piece of wood, unremarkable in its natural state, but brimming with potential in his hands. His carving knife moved with precision, guided by a grim purpose. The tailor would be the first. Nicholas's mind burned with the memory of the man's cruelty, the venom in his voice as he berated his wife, the icy disdain as he dismissed those in need. A man like that didn't deserve to live without consequence. He deserved to be punished. The figure began to take shape, a small marionette with jointed limbs and hollow eyes. Nicholas carved each detail meticulously, the sharp angles of its face, the tiny stitching etched into its coat, the delicate strings that would bring it to life. It was his finest work, and his darkest. When the marionette was complete, Nicholas placed it gently on the table and leaned back in his chair. His gaze lingered on the toy, his thoughts heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. This isn't wrong, as though convincing himself. It's justice. That night the village was silent, the snow muffling every sound. Nicholas crept through the darkness, the marionette tucked carefully inside his coat. He moved with purpose, his breath visible in the icy air, his footsteps deliberate and slow. The tailor's house loomed ahead, its windows dark, the inhabitants long asleep. Nicholas approached the door, his gloved hand resting lightly on the handle. It turned without resistance. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and stale brandy. Nicholas moved through the shadows like a wraith, his eyes fixed on the figure slumped in the chair by the fire. The tailor snored softly, oblivious to the presence of the toymaker who stood over him. Nicholas reached into his coat and withdrew the marionette. Its hollow eyes seemed to glint in the faint light, its limbs limp and lifeless. He placed it carefully on the table beside the tailor, arranging its strings so that they draped like the threads of fate. Then he waited. The fire crackled softly as the tailor stirred, his hand twitching against the armrest. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he stared blankly at the room before his gaze fell on the marionette. What the... He reached out to touch the toy, his fingers brushing against its wooden body. The strings seemed to move of their own accord, curling like tendrils around his wrist. The tailor jerked back, but it was too late. The strings tightened, digging into his skin, drawing crimson lines that seeped through the thin fibers. His breath hitched as the marionette's hollow eyes seemed to glow, its limbs jerking unnaturally. Nicholas watched from the shadows, his heart pounding as the tailor began to gasp, clawing at the strings that now snaked around his throat. The marionette climbed onto his chest, its wooden limbs moving with eerie precision, its carved mouth curling into a grotesque smile. The tailor's struggles grew weaker, his hands falling limp as the life drained from his eyes. When it was over, the marionette sat motionless atop his chest, its head tilted in silent judgment. Nicholas stepped forward, his boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. He picked up the marionette, cradling it in his hands like a prized possession. "You've done well," he murmured, his voice soft and reverent. He turned to leave, his movements careful and deliberate. As he stepped out into the snow, he glanced back at the house one last time. The firelight flickered in the window, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. The village would find the body in the morning, his face frozen in a mask of terror, the marionette nowhere to be seen. Nicholas returned to his cabin, his mind racing with possibilities. The tailor had been the first, but he wouldn't be the last. He set the marionette on the shelf beside his other toys, its hollow eyes staring out into the room. The toymaker's work was far from over. "This is just the beginning," Nicholas whispered to himself, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The sun rose over Kaleheim, its weak light barely piercing the heavy clouds that hung low over the village. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the ground pristine and undisturbed, except for the tracks leading to the tailor's house. It was a milkmaid who found him. She had knocked on the door to deliver her usual jug of cream, but received no answer. Curious, she pushed the door open and stepped inside, only to stumble back moments later, her scream tearing through the quiet morning air. The villagers came running, their boots crunching in the snow as they gathered in front of the house. It wasn't long before the bravest among them stepped inside, only to return pale-faced and shaking. "He's dead," the blacksmith said, his voice rough with disbelief. "Strangled." "But by what?" the others murmured, their voices rising and falling like the wind through the trees. Whispers of fear spread quickly, each rumor more outlandish than the last. "He was cursed," someone muttered. "No, it was murder," another insisted. "But there was no one else here," the butcher said, his thick hands trembling as he wiped them on his apron. "And the marks, they weren't made by hands. It was something else." The rumors only grew when they saw the marks on the tailor's throat, thin, precise lines as if made by threads or strings. And then there was his face, frozen in terror, his lifeless eyes wide and staring at something unseen. By midday, the entire village was buzzing with speculation. Children were kept indoors, doors and windows were locked, and no one dared to be alone after dark. Nicholas watched it all from the shadows, his presence unnoticed amidst the chaos. He lingered near the edges of the crowd, listening to the murmurs and studying the fear etched into every face. "They're afraid," he whispered to himself, a strange satisfaction blooming in his chest. Good. But not everyone was so quick to succumb to fear. The priest, a stout man with a booming voice, stood at the center of the square, rallying the villagers with fiery words. "This is the work of evil," he declared, his breath visible in the frigid air, "and we must root it out. Whoever is responsible for this will answer to the Almighty." Nicholas's lip curled at the priest's words. He had seen the man's hypocrisy, the way he stole from the church's coffers to fund his own indulgences. The villagers might look to him for guidance, but Nicholas knew the truth. "He'll get what's coming to him," Nicholas muttered, his gaze cold and steady. That night the village was eerily quiet. Even the animals seemed to sense the tension, their calls muted beneath the heavy blanket of snow. Nicholas sat in his cabin, his workbench illuminated by the flickering light of a single candle. He ran his fingers over the marionette's smooth surface, its hollow eyes reflecting the faint glow of the flame. It had done its job well, and now it sat motionless on the shelf, a silent reminder of what he had set in motion. But there was more work to be done. The tailor had been only the beginning, a warning to the village of what lay beneath their fragile veneer of civility. Nicholas reached for another block of wood, his knife glinting in the candlelight. His next target was clear: the baker. The image of the man's ruddy face flashed in Nicholas's mind, his laughter masking the petty cruelties he inflicted on those who trusted him. Nicholas's hands moved with practiced precision as he began to carve, the shape of a rolling pin emerging from the wood. It would be his finest work yet, a gift the baker would never forget. The baker's shop stood at the heart of Kelheim, its crooked sign creaking softly in the icy wind. By day, the air around it was warm with the smell of fresh bread and pastries, but by night it was silent and cold. The village had retreated indoors, their fear locking them behind bolted doors. But Nicholas was wide awake. His hands moved with meticulous precision as he carved the final detail into the rolling pin, a pattern of swirling vines along its handle, deceptively delicate for the violence it would soon bring. The wood felt alive in his hands, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. Nicholas set it down, wiping the thin layer of sweat from his brow. It was ready. Under the cover of darkness, Nicholas made his way to the baker's shop. The snow crunched beneath his boots, muffled by the thick night air. The moon hung high, its light barely piercing the dense clouds, casting an eerie glow over the village. The shop door was locked, but Nicholas had learned to pick locks long ago, back when he watched more and acted less. The tumblers clicked softly under his deft hands, and the door swung open with a faint creak. Inside, the air was still warm, the scent of bread lingering faintly. The baker lay sprawled in his chair near the oven, a bottle of wine dangling from his thick fingers. His snores echoed through the room, punctuated by the occasional crackle of the dying fire. Nicholas stepped closer, his movement silent as a shadow. He placed the rolling pin on the wooden counter, arranging it carefully so it would be the first thing the baker saw when he woke. Then he stepped back, retreating into the darkness of the corner. Minutes passed. Then the baker stirred. His eyes fluttered open, squinting against the dim light. He groaned, rubbing a hand over his face, and sat up, the bottle of wine slipping from his grasp and rolling onto the floor. His gaze fell on the rolling pin. At first, he didn't react. It was just a rolling pin after all, albeit a fine one, finer than anything he owned. He reached for it, his fingers curling around the smooth handle, and lifted it to examine the intricate carvings. The first crack of bone was almost inaudible, a soft, wet sound as the rolling pin moved on its own, twisting in his grasp. The baker gasped, his hand spasming as the wood seemed to come alive, its vines tightening around his fingers like tendrils. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice thick with confusion and fear. The rolling pin jerked violently, slamming against his wrist with a sickening crunch. The baker screamed, dropping it, but the pin didn't fall. It hovered midair, spinning slowly before launching itself at his chest. The impact knocked him back into the chair, the breath leaving his lungs in a wheezing gasp. The rolling pin struck again and again, moving with unnatural precision. It hit his ribs, his face, his hands as he tried to shield himself, leaving a trail of blood and broken bones in its wake. The baker scrambled to his feet, his movements clumsy and desperate. He stumbled toward the door, but the rolling pin was faster. It struck the back of his knees, sending him crashing to the ground. He screamed, but no one came. The rolling pin pinned him to the floor, its vines twisting around his throat. The baker clawed at them, his nails scraping against the wood, but it was useless. The vines tightened, cutting off his breath, and his struggles grew weaker. Nicholas stepped forward, his shadow falling over the baker's broken body. He knelt beside him, his gloved hand reaching out to brush a lock of blood-matted hair from the man's face. "You always laughed," Nicholas said softly, his voice steady. "Laughed at their pain, at their desperation. Tell me, does it feel as good now?" The baker's eyes widened, a final flicker of realization before the vines tightened one last time. Silence fell over the shop. Nicholas stood, cradling the rolling pin in his hands as its vines unwound, returning to their lifeless state. He placed it carefully on the counter, a quiet memento of what had transpired. By morning, the villagers would find the baker's body, a scene of chaos and blood that defied explanation. Nicholas walked back to his cabin, the snow swallowing his footprints as though he had never been there. The toy on the shelf seemed to stare at him when he returned, its hollow eyes glinting faintly in the firelight. "This is justice," Nicholas whispered, more to himself than the room. "There's so much more to give." Morning broke over Kaleheim with a brittle, icy stillness. But the peace didn't last. The baker's shop was the first to stir, but not with the scent of fresh bread or the hum of morning chores. Instead, it was the milkmaid again, her screams splitting the cold dawn like an axe through wood. By the time the villagers arrived, drawn by her cries, the scene inside was more horrifying than they could have imagined. The baker's body lay crumpled on the floor, his face twisted in agony, his limbs bent unnaturally. Blood streaked the wooden planks, pooling beneath him in a dark, viscous stain. But it wasn't the body alone that sent shivers down their spines. It was the rolling pin on the counter, pristine and untouched, its intricate carvings glinting faintly in the weak sunlight. "Another one," the blacksmith muttered, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. The whispers spread like wildfire. The tailor's death had been strange enough, but now the baker. 2 men, each found dead in their own homes, with no sign of a struggle beyond the impossible injuries that defied explanation. "It's a curse," an older woman whispered, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "It's punishment," said the priest, his voice trembling despite the conviction in his words. "The sins of this village have brought judgment upon us." Nicholas stood at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of quiet concern. He had slipped into the throng unnoticed, his plain coat blending in with the other villagers. His sharp eyes darted from one face to the next, watching as fear took hold. The blacksmith's broad shoulders hunched under the weight of suspicion. 2 men dead in 2 days, he said, his voice rough. And both of them, well, they weren't exactly saints, were they? The crowd fell silent. It was true. The tailor had been a cruel man, his sharp tongue as cutting as his scissors. And the baker, for all his joviality, had his share of secrets, taking more than his due, mocking those who came to him in need. "Do you think a young woman began, her voice shaking? Do you think someone's doing this? Someone who knows?" The question hung in the frigid air, and Nicholas felt a flicker of satisfaction. They were beginning to see it, to feel the weight of their own guilt pressing down on them. "No one in this village would do such a thing," the priest snapped, his voice rising above the whispers. "This is the work of something far darker. We must come together, now more than ever. Stay vigilant, pray, and trust that righteousness will prevail." Nicholas's lip curled at the priest's words, but he said nothing. He slipped away from the crowd as they began to scatter, retreating to the safety of their homes. By midday, the village was quieter than it had ever been. Windows were shuttered, doors locked tight. No one lingered in the streets, and even the animals seemed subdued, their usual chatter silenced by the oppressive tension. Inside their homes, the villagers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting to shadows that seemed to grow longer with each passing hour. Some whispered of ghosts or demons, of old curses and forgotten sins. Others wondered if one of their own was behind the killings, their trust fraying like old thread. Nicholas sat by his fire, the faint crackle of the flames the only sound in his cabin. On the shelf beside him, the marionette and the rolling pin sat side by side, their hollow eyes and delicate carvings casting flickering shadows on the walls. "They're afraid," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "They should be." But even as the villagers cowered, Nicholas knew he couldn't stop. Fear was only the beginning. They needed to understand the depth of their sins, the consequences of their actions. Only then could they change, if they survived long enough. He turned back to his workbench, his knife glinting in the firelight. There was more to be done. The cobbler would be next, his lies and greed laid bare for all to see. And the village, fractured and fearful, would watch as justice came for them one by one. The cobbler's shop was small, tucked away at the far edge of Kelheim, where the streets grew narrow and the houses leaned together like conspirators. It was a modest building, its shutters perpetually askew, its door worn from years of neglect. Yet inside, the cobbler thrived, not because of honest work, but because of his lies. Nicholas had watched him closely over the past weeks. He had seen the cobbler sell patched boots as new, charge exorbitant prices to desperate parents needing shoes for their children, and laugh in their faces. It was time the cobbler faced judgment. This time, Nicholas's hands carved with a different intensity. He selected a block of dark wood, its grain as twisted as the man it was meant for, and began shaping it into a pair of shoes. But these were no ordinary shoes. Their soles bore jagged teeth, hidden beneath delicate carvings of vines and flowers. Their laces were coiled tightly, thin but strong like sinews ready to constrict. Nicholas worked late into the night, the soft rasp of his knife the only sound in the cabin. When the shoes were complete, he ran his fingers over the polished wood, testing the sharpness of the hidden blades and the strength of the laces. Satisfied, he placed them in a simple box lined with soft cloth. The cobbler's reckoning would come at dawn. The sky was still dark when Nicholas approached the cobbler's shop, the box tucked under his arm. He left it on the doorstep, carefully positioned so the morning light would catch the carvings on the lid. Then he retreated into the shadows, waiting for the man to awaken. The cobbler opened his door just as the first rays of sun pierced the horizon. His small eyes narrowed as he looked down at the box, suspicion flickering across his face. He glanced up and down the street, but no one was there. Curiosity won out. He crouched down, picked up the box, and carried it inside. Nicholas watched through a crack in the shutters as the cobbler set the box on his workbench and opened it. "Shoes," the cobbler muttered, his voice thick with disdain. "And fine ones, too. Whoever left these must be a fool." He lifted them from the box, his rough fingers tracing the intricate carvings. The shoes seemed to gleam in the faint light, their surface smooth as glass. The cobbler's greed overtook him. "They'll fetch a high price," he said to himself, sliding the shoes onto his feet. The moment his heels touched the soles, the shoes tightened, their laces snapping to life and winding around his ankles like living vines. The cobbler let out a strangled cry, stumbling back as the teeth in the soles pressed against his skin. What in God's name? The shoes moved. They twisted his feet unnaturally, forcing him to stand as the blades began to pierce his flesh. Blood seeped through the seams, staining the delicate carvings. He clawed at the laces, but they tightened further, cutting into his skin like wire. The shoes carried him forward, their soles clicking loudly against the wooden floor. The cobbler screamed, his voice raw with terror and pain, but no one was near enough to hear. The shoes marched him into the back room, where his tools lay scattered on the workbench. They stopped suddenly, and for a moment, the cobbler thought it was over. But then the blades moved deeper, cutting tendons, severing flesh. He collapsed, his legs buckling beneath him, but the shoes wouldn't release him. His screams faded into weak gasps as the shoes twisted one final time, leaving him crumpled in a heap on the blood-stained floor. Nicholas stepped inside moments later, his expression calm as he surveyed the scene. The cobbler's lifeless body lay still, his blood pooling around the cursed shoes. "You built your life on lies," Nicholas said softly, almost as if addressing the shoes themselves. "Now you've walked the path you deserved." He removed the shoes carefully, their laces loosening at his touch. He wiped the blood from their polished surface and placed them back in the box. By morning, the cobbler would be found just like the others, broken, bloodied, and surrounded by mystery, and the village's fear would grow, just as Nicholas intended. As he returned to his cabin, the cursed shoes joined the marionette and the rolling pin on the shelf. They gleamed in the firelight, their delicate carvings hiding the darkness within. Nicholas smiled faintly. Justice was being served, one soul at a time. By the time the cobbler's body was discovered, the village of Kaleheim was already unraveling. Fear had burrowed into every corner, festering in locked houses and whispered conversations. The milkmaid, once again the unlucky soul, to stumble upon the scene, swore she would never leave her home before sunrise again. The cobbler's shop became a gathering place for the brave or the foolish. Villagers clustered near the door, peering inside, but refusing to cross the threshold. The sight of the blood-stained floor and the cobbler's twisted body was too much for most, their hands trembling as they clutched shawls and coats. "What kind of monster could do this?" the blacksmith asked, his voice breaking. "No monster," the priest said grimly. "This is divine punishment. Each of these men had sins to atone for. Surely you see the pattern." The villagers murmured in agreement, though their faces betrayed uncertainty. The tailor's sharp tongue, the baker's greed, the cobbler's lies. Each man's flaws were well known, their deaths almost poetic in their gruesome irony. "But who decides what's a sin?" a young woman asked, her voice trembling. "And who's next?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered. Nicholas stood at the back of the crowd, his expression carefully neutral. He had positioned himself as a quiet observer, a face among many. But his sharp eyes missed nothing. The way the villagers avoided meeting one another's gaze, the way their voices wavered when they spoke. "They're turning on each other," he thought, a faint flicker of satisfaction warming his chest. By midday, the whispers had grown louder, more accusatory. Fingers began to point, each person searching for someone else to blame. "It has to be one of us," the butcher said, his thick arms crossed over his chest. "No one else comes to this village. Whoever's doing this, they're hiding in plain sight." "Or it's one of you," snapped the blacksmith. "You've got the strength for it." The butcher bristled, his face reddening. "And you don't? You think we haven't noticed the way you've been looking at everyone? Always watching, always listening, like you're waiting for something." The tension was palpable, the air heavy with mistrust. Old grudges surfaced, grudges that had festered in silence for years. The priest raised his hands, his booming voice cutting through the chaos. "Enough! We cannot turn on each other. That is what the evil wants." "Then what do we do?" someone shouted. "Wait to be the next one found dead in their own home." The priest hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. He had no answers, only his faith, and in Kaleheim, faith was beginning to wear thin. That night the village felt more isolated than ever. The streets were deserted, the silence broken only by the occasional howl of wind. Candles flickered in windows, casting faint, trembling light onto the snow. Inside their homes, the villagers whispered behind closed doors, their fear tangible. Families huddled together, clutching each other tightly, their ears straining for sounds that didn't belong. Nicholas sat in his cabin, the firelight dancing across his face. The marionette, the rolling pin, and the shoes seemed to watch him from the shelf, their hollow eyes glinting faintly. "They're afraid," he murmured, his voice soft and steady. "But fear isn't enough. Not yet." He turned to his workbench, his hands reaching for the next block of wood. The priest's voice rang in his memory, loud and self-righteous. Nicholas's lips curled into a cold smile. The priest would be next. Nicholas's hands moved with a purpose sharper than the blade in his grasp. The firelight danced on the edges of the wooden cross he was carving, its smooth surface polished to perfection. This would be his most intricate work yet. The delicate lines of scripture etched onto its arms, masking the darkness that lay within. The priest's voice echoed in his mind, self-righteous proclamations, condemnation of others' sins, and hollow promises of salvation. Nicholas had seen what the villagers could not, the priest slipping into homes under the guise of prayer, taking what wasn't his, coins from the poor, trinkets from the grieving, and even trust from the devout. The weight of his hypocrisy fueled every stroke of the carving knife. When the cross was complete, it gleamed with a dark beauty. Hidden within the wood were thin, razor-sharp blades, lying dormant until the moment they were needed. The base was hollow, housing a mechanism that Nicholas had carefully constructed, a spring that would bring the blades to life. "It's fitting," Nicholas murmured as he turned the cross over in his hands. A man who claims to hold the moral high ground should meet his end on the very symbol of his faith. The night was still when Nicholas approached the church, his breath curling into the cold air. The building loomed like a shadow against the snow, its windows dark save for the faint flicker of candlelight within. The priest often stayed late, praying in solitude, or so the villagers believed. Nicholas slipped through the door, his movement silent as a whisper. The church was empty, the pews bathed in dim light. At the front, the priest knelt before the altar, his hands clasped in prayer. His back was to the door, his head bowed, unaware of the figure that now stood in the shadows behind him. Nicholas placed the cross on the altar, its polished surface gleaming faintly. He stepped back, blending into the darkness as he watched. The priest finished his prayer and rose to his feet. He sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging as he wiped his hands over his face. It was then that he saw the cross. He froze, his eyes narrowing as he stared at it. Slowly he reached out, his fingers brushing the carved surface. The scripture etched into the wood caught the light, its familiar words drawing him closer. "What is this?" he muttered, his voice low. He lifted the cross from the altar, turning it over in his hands. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the detail painstaking, yet there was something unsettling about it, something he couldn't quite place. The first blade shot out with a soft click, slicing through the priest's palm. He yelped, dropping the cross, but the mechanism had already been triggered. The remaining blade sprang to life, extending from the arms of the cross like jagged wings. The priest stumbled back, clutching his bleeding hand. "What in God's name?" The cross moved. It hovered for a moment, its blades glinting ominously before launching itself forward. The priest screamed as it struck him, the blade slicing through his robes and into his flesh. He fell to the ground, writhing as the cross pinned him down, its weight impossibly heavy. The blades twisted, digging deeper, carving into his chest. The priest's screams echoed through the empty church, mingling with the sound of splintering wood and tearing fabric. His blood pooled beneath him, staining the altar steps. Nicholas stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He knelt beside the priest, his expression calm as he watched the life drain from the man's eyes. "You claim to be their shepherd," Nicholas said softly, his voice steady. "But you preyed on your flock. This is your judgment." The priest's lips moved, forming silent words, but no sound came. The light in his eyes faded, leaving them wide and staring. Nicholas rose, his work complete. He retrieved the cross, its blades retracting as he placed it carefully in his bag. The bloodstains would fade in time, but the fear it left behind would linger. By the time the villagers found the priest, the church would be silent, save for the echoes of their own terror, and Nicholas would already be preparing for the next judgment. Nicholas stood before his shelf of tools, his marionette, the rolling pin, the cursed shoes, and now the blood-stained cross. Each object gleamed faintly in the firelight, their delicate craftsmanship belying their deadly purpose. Together they told a story of judgment, a story that was far from finished. The priest's demise had been more than justice. It was a message, a crack in the foundation of Kelheim's fragile faith. Nicholas could see it in the villagers' faces, in the way they moved like shadows through the snow, their trust in one another eroding with every whispered suspicion. "They're beginning to understand," he murmured, his voice low. "But fear alone won't save them. They need to change." His fingers brushed over the marionette's wooden limbs, then drifted to the rolling pin and the cross. Each creation had served its purpose well, but Nicholas knew the time for subtlety was over. The village needed to see his work, truly see it. He would no longer hide in the shadows. He turned back to his workbench, a plan already forming in his mind. This time, the target wouldn't be an individual. It would be the village itself. That night, the snow fell heavier than it had in weeks, blanketing Kaleheim in a suffocating silence. Nicholas worked through the storm, his hands steady as they shaped the wood before him. The object he was crafting was unlike anything he had made before. Taller, broader, with more moving parts. It was a grotesque amalgamation of his earlier works. The limbs of the marionette, the blades of the cross, the crushing weight of the shoes, and the precise mechanisms that brought them to life. He carved intricate patterns into its surface, each symbol a twisted mockery of the village's virtues. When it was finished, the figure stood taller than Nicholas himself, its wooden body looming in the dim light. Its hollow eyes stared blankly ahead, its limbs jointed and poised for movement. It was a puppet, a grotesque effigy of Kaleheim's sins, brought to life by Nicholas's careful hands. He tied strings to its limbs, the cords thick and unyielding, and tested its movements. The puppet responded with eerie fluidity, its carved mouth curling into a sinister grin. "This will be your witness," Nicholas said softly, addressing the puppet as though it could hear him. "Your testament to the truth." At the break of dawn, Nicholas carried the puppet to the center of the village. The snow had stopped, leaving the streets empty and still. He worked quickly, tying the strings to the tall wooden post that marked the square's center. The puppet hung limply at first, its limbs lifeless, but Nicholas adjusted the cords until it stood upright, its blank eyes fixed on the surrounding houses. By the time the villagers awoke, the puppet was ready. The first scream came from a young boy, his voice sharp enough to rouse the entire village. Doors creaked open, hesitant footsteps crunching in the snow as the townsfolk gathered in the square. Their gasps filled the air as they saw the puppet, a towering figure carved with unsettling precision, its expression both lifeless and accusing. "What is this?" the blacksmith stammered, his face pale. The villagers whispered among themselves, their voices trembling with fear and confusion. But as they drew closer, they began to notice the carvings, the symbols etched into the wood, the names and sins woven into the puppet's surface like a tapestry. The tailor, the baker, the cobbler, the priest. Each name was there, alongside the marks of their deeds. It's them," someone said, their voice barely audible. "It's the ones who died." The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of fear and suspicion. Some fell to their knees, clutching their rosaries and murmuring prayers. Others shouted accusations, their voices rising in desperation. Nicholas watched from the shadows, his hood pulled low over his face. The chaos was beautiful in its own way, a reflection of the village's true nature. But this was only the beginning. The puppet moved, its head jerked to the side, its hollow eyes scanning the crowd. Its limbs twitched, the strings pulling taut as it raised one wooden arm and pointed directly at a man in the crowd. The butcher. The villagers fell silent, their gazes snapping to the man. He stumbled back, his face a mask of terror. I didn't do anything," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I've done nothing wrong." The puppet stepped forward, its wooden feet crunching against the snow. The strings moved as though pulled by invisible hands, guiding it closer to the butcher. Its carved mouth opened, and though no sound escaped, the message was clear. Judgment. The puppet stood in the square, its hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. The villagers froze, their breath visible in the icy air, as the grotesque effigy raised its arm once more, its wooden hand pointing toward the butcher. "No, this is madness," the butcher screamed, stumbling backward. He turned to flee, but the puppet moved faster, its limbs jerking forward with eerie precision. The strings seemed to hum with energy, pulling the puppet closer to its target. The butcher tripped over a snowdrift, his large body crashing to the ground. Before he could rise, the puppet loomed over him. Its wooden fingers closed around his throat with unnatural strength, lifting him effortlessly into the air. His struggles grew weaker as the villagers watched in stunned silence, their fear rooting them in place. With a sickening crunch, the puppet released the lifeless body, letting it crumple into the snow. Its head swiveled unnaturally, scanning the crowd for its next target. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the square as the villagers scattered, their fear driving them into the night. But there was no escape. From the shadows, Nicholas watched with a cold satisfaction as the puppet moved with terrifying speed, its strings pulling it toward the fleeing townsfolk. The blacksmith, desperate and panicked, grabbed a hammer from his belt and swung it wildly as the puppet closed in. But the weapon struck only air as the strings lashed out, wrapping around his wrists and yanking the hammer from his grasp. The puppet twisted the strings, forcing his arms upward as the sharp blades hidden in its body extended. The blacksmith's screams echoed into the night as the blades found their mark, carving deep into his chest. He collapsed, his blood staining the snow in a dark, steaming pool. One by one, the villagers fell. The seamstress, who had mocked the poor with scraps of cloth, was ensnared by the puppet's strings and dragged into the square. Her cries were cut short as the strings tightened around her throat, her body jerking like a marionette as she was lifted into the air. The farmer, who hoarded grain while others starved, tried to hide in the barn. But the puppet found him, its hollow eyes glowing as it advanced. The barn erupted in flames, the man's screams mingling with the crackle of burning wood. The priest's death had been a warning, but now it was an inferno of judgment. Nicholas followed silently, unseen, as the puppet carried out his will, its strings weaving through the night like threads of fate. Each death was swift, brutal, and fitting, a reflection of the sins they had committed. By dawn, the village was silent. The square was littered with bodies, their blood staining the snow red. The puppet stood in the center, motionless now, its strings slack and lifeless. The names carved into its surface seemed to shimmer faintly in the pale light, as though the wood itself bore witness to what had transpired. Only one remained. Amara, the milkmaid, huddled in the shadows of her home. She had watched from the window as her neighbors fell, too terrified to move. Her heart thundered in her chest as she heard the footsteps crunching through the snow, growing closer. The door creaked open and she screamed, her voice hoarse with terror. But it wasn't the puppet. It was Nicholas. He stepped inside, his face calm, his eyes steady as he looked at her. In his hands he held the marionette, the first of his tools, the one that had started it all. "You'll live," Nicholas said, "not because you are innocent, but because someone must remember." Amara sobbed, her hands trembling as she clutched her knees. Why? Why are you doing this?" Nicholas crouched in front of her, his expression unreadable. "Because the world is broken and no one cares to fix it. This village was rotting from within. I did what had to be done." She stared at him, her tears freezing on her cheeks. "You're a monster." Nicholas smiled faintly. "No, I am a reminder." He stood and turned to leave, the marionette still cradled in his hands. "Tell them what you saw. Tell them what happens to those who choose cruelty over kindness. Let them know I am always watching." As he stepped into the snow, the puppet in the square moved one last time, its hollow eyes locking onto Amara's window before falling still. Amara fled Kaleheim that morning, leaving the ruined village behind. She carried the tale with her, whispering it to anyone who would listen. The story spread like wildfire, growing with each retelling. They say he comes in the night, watching, judging. He sees every sin, every kindness, every cruelty. He brings gifts to the good, but to the wicked, he brings only judgment. His name is Nicholas, and he is always watching. And there you have it, dreamers. the truth behind the jolly man in red. St. Nicholas wasn't always a symbol of joy. His story began in the shadows, with judgment and fear, reminding us that every action has a consequence. So this holiday season, when you hang your stockings and lay your head down to sleep, ask yourself, have you been good this year? Because Nicholas is always watching, always judging, and he knows. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the ghost icon to make sure you don't miss any of the tales we've got coming your way. After all, you wouldn't want to disappoint him. Until next time, sleep tight and dream of something nice. Or else.